pase, pierna derecha, directo al arco, ¡golazo! ¡Golazo!
The world of football with a soccer perspective. This is Soccer Today with Duane, Rollins and Kevin Laramee, live on the Sports Podcasting Network.
Good day, good night, and welcome to Soccer Today for Wednesday, October 10th, 2018. A year later, joining us on the line right now from ESPN, Jeff Carlisle, to talk about the U.S. men's national team a year later and the San Jose Quakes head coach situation. Good morning, Jeff.
Good morning. How are you?
We're well, Jeff. I'm going to start by asking a question that I asked my followers on Twitter this morning, and it's a pretty simple one. It's 1 year later, the U.S. men's national team program is in blank, and then the selected answers were worse shape, the same shape, or better shape. How would you answer that?
I mean, I'm going. It depends on what aspect of the program you're talking about. I would, if I had to pick one of those three, I would say the same shape. I think there has been some progress made on the player front. I think, as you know, just in terms of a new crop of guys being brought in, some of whom I think are pretty talented. You know, like a Wes McKinney. You know, like a Tyler Adams. But there's still no coach. You know, we keep being told that, you know, hey, it's going to happen by the end of the year, but you know, it's that whole night in Trinidad and what happened after. I mean, that's still kind of, it's like one of those zombies. It's like one of those zombies in a zombie movie where, you know, he's still clutching at the protagonist, you know, still trying to take him down. And, you know, I don't think the U.S. program has really been able to shake itself, you know, from the memory of that night. And I think hiring a new coach will, you know, accelerate that process just in terms of kind of putting that behind them. So, you know, in terms of the leadership, you know, there's a new USSF president. I guess maybe you could say on that front things are better because obviously Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. are going to be hosting the 2026 World Cup. But in terms of structural changes that have been made, you know, to the federation, yes, there's a GM in Ernie Stewart, but overall, you know, some of the burning questions, some of the deeper questions about development and things like that, you know, that is very much the same. So I guess my answer in the end is it's mostly the same. I think there's some areas where things are better, but overall, I think it's stagnating in others.
Just for the record, the listeners, 57% agree with you that it's in the same shape, with 27% saying worse shape, and 16% right now saying they're in a better shape. I guess my question is, as an outsider, Kevin and I, for those, if you're listening to us the first time, are Canadians. We're very strong observers of the U.S. team, but we're not emotionally attached to it in the same way that an American might be. So we look at the U.S. program, we look at what happened a year ago tonight, and we see it as a bit of an outlier. That, you know, 2 nights before or 3 nights before, they you know, Josie had a hat trick and they looked at everything was right. That night, a couple things go a different way. They're going to the World Cup. How much change really does there need to happen, Jeff, in your mind? How much of an overhaul was there needed because of what, you know, was a sporting result that sometimes just happens a year ago today?
Well, I think I'm not one of those people that says, you know, burn the whole thing to the ground and start over. I mean, you know, just thinking of the players that I mentioned, I mean, those guys are all products of the U.S. system. So, you know, clearly, and when you throw in guys like Josh Sargent at Werder Bremen, and you know, and it seems like every other week there's another academy product that's signing with a European club, either at youth level or with the full team. So clearly, the U.S. system is doing some things right. But I think there was some complacency certainly crept into, you know, just the development system. So, yes, you can say it was just one of those fluke things, but, you know, I think it did bring to the forefront, you know, a lot of flaws, you know, in the U.S. system and in the way it develops players. I mean, there's a whole generation, I think, that kind of got caught up in the middle of that last cycle who really didn't deliver. You know, I'm thinking of guys like Breck Shea and even like a Juan Agudelo. I mean, some of that's injury-induced in the case of Agudelo. You know, it seems like he can't go a whole season without picking up some injury. But, you know, I think that was symptomatic of a generation that just did not break through. So, as much as it can be a fluke, I mean, there were also 9 other days. There were 9 other match days, and the bottom line is the U.S. didn't get enough points on those days to get through. And I'm thinking of the Costa Rica game at home. I'm thinking of Panama away. So I mean, I think it's worth looking at and examining and doing some reflection on, what can the Federation as a whole and what can the U.S. soccer system as a whole do better. And I think a lot of that focuses on development, just making the game more inclusive for people, not pricing people out of the system. There's a lot of skepticism about whether you can get rid of pay to play, but I still think blunting the financial impacts on families is a worthwhile goal. So I'm not saying that's an easy problem to solve, but it's one that I think certainly needs to be examined more closely.
When we look at the coach situation, you mentioned a bit earlier, still no coach for the U.S. men's national team, at least not a full-time one and not one for the future. There's a lot of names that have been talked about over the last few months, and some say maybe at the end of the MLS season and at the end of the Columbus Crew season, we'll have more clear picture about the national team head coach. Where does the lack of a head coach hurt? I'm asking, is it dangerous for the transition into a new system, new tactics, the future? We're almost only a year away, not even, from World Cup qualifiers. There's Nations League next year. Is it going to be impeding the progress of the U.S. men's national team to not have a coach that have already transitioned the tactics from Klinsmann to wherever they're going?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair question. I think it does hurt. Because every coach, has a player or two that no one else would pick, for the national team, that for whatever reason, there's something about their attributes that fits that particular coach's system or style or, what have you. And so, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think the first question, some progress has been made in terms of bringing in a new generation of players. But I think we've reached the limit. The U.S. has reached the limit of just how impactful these friendlies can be. Given that Dave Sarachan is not going to be the head coach going forward. So we'll see if Greg Berhalter ends up being that guy. But I don't think it's fatal by any means, because let's face it. What's really going to dictate how the U.S. team does is how these up and coming players do with their clubs. Over the next 18 to 24 months, guys like McKennie and Adams and Matt Miazga have got to continue to get games with their clubs and continue to progress. And that's where we're really going to see the development for this particular team shine through. So I think it does hurt a little bit. I'm not, a sky is falling type. I don't have a sky is falling type opinion on this. But the coach needs to be hired sooner rather than later, and certainly listening to U.S. Soccer, that's the plan. But again, it's what happens at the club level is really going to have a huge impact on how the U.S. team does going forward.
Over the last few years, there's been great young talents that have been breaking through that glass ceiling for the U.S. men's national team. We're talking about Christian Pulisic, Josh Sargent, you mentioned Tyler Adams as well. In the next year, 2 years ahead of us, when we get to the World Cup qualifiers, those players will become the core group of this U.S. men's national team. But when we saw the roster for the upcoming friendlies, of course, Michael Bradley and a few other veterans were chosen. What is your opinion on the importance of those mentors that could become actually mentors to the next generation?
I think it is important. I think it's, I think you have to remember that the guys like McKennie and Pulisic and Adams, I mean, they're basically 20 years old. And so I don't think these guys are at the point where they've learned everything there is to learn about the game. And even a guy like McKennie has said that, the international game is different than playing for his club. Just the emotions involved. I mean, that's not to say there aren't emotions involved playing for Schalke, but it's a different kind of emotion. Representing your country, I think it just presents a different type of connection. So I think having guys like Bradley, like Guzan, I think that can only help. There have been some questions about whether a guy like Michael Bradley provides the right kind of leadership. I think he's evolved as a leader, over the course of his career. I remember him, during the run to the playoffs last year, I remember him making the comment that, hey, while he could think about the game 24/7, not everybody's wired like that, and that he had to acknowledge that. So to me, that shows an evolution in the kind of leader that he is. I mean, some people will say he's still too overbearing, and whether that's needed right now or whether he needs to dial it back, we'll see. But I mean, Michael Bradley's a smart guy, and I think he can read situations well in terms of what a particular young player needs to hear or to experience. So I don't have any problem with the veterans being brought in. Now, if Michael Bradley is still the starting midfielder heading into World Cup qualifying, then I think that's time to worry a little bit. That means that some of these guys have not broken through, and that we're left with this. The U.S. is left with a situation where, like they did in the last cycle, where a guy like Jermaine Jones could not be pushed out until the latter stages of the cycle. Really that needed to be happening much earlier. And I don't think it was for lack of trying. I just don't think some of these guys, developed enough in their individual games to push a guy like Jones out. And so that's the real challenge, I think, for the McKennies and the Adamses of the world, is to play so well and come so far that, it's a no-brainer in terms of having them on the field instead of a Michael Bradley.
Perhaps the most divisive player in the pool in terms of whether he should continue to be part of the pool, whether he should have a key role to the pool, is the other Toronto U.S. men's national team player, and that's Jozy Altidore. What is his role, do you feel, in the next cycle?
I think it's going to be much bigger than, say, that of a Michael Bradley. When you look at the center of midfield where Bradley plays, that seems to be the kind of player that the U.S. produces in abundance. So I think there are a lot of candidates that, have the potential to come through and get a lot of playing time in that part of the field. You can't say the same in terms of the forwards. There's a reason why Josh Sargent was called into the national team last May when he hadn't played a professional game. They wanted to get a look at him. Obviously, he's done great things at youth level, but there's just not a lot of depth in the forward positions. I mean, Bobby Wood has started to perk up at club level a little bit after some really brutal spells with Hamburg. I mean, obviously he's with Hanover now, but I think Jozy Altidore, he's still 28 years old. And so, he's still young enough, and I still think he has, enough to offer that he should definitely be considered. You cannot write a guy like Jozy off, given the way that he has historically produced for the U.S. and for Toronto FC. So he's a guy that I think will definitely be in the mix during this cycle.
You're around the program right now as we speak. I'm just curious how much this anniversary is hanging over. Is it a big shadow, or are they trying to downplay it? Just what is sort of the mood as it relates to Trinidad right now?
Yeah, they're trying to downplay it. I talked to Bradley and Brad Guzan about it, and they're like, hey, you got to just put these things behind you and move forward. And that's the case when you win, and then that's the case, when you lose. So I think it's there. I don't think it's, just this incredibly crippling psychological hangover that they're going through right now. I think, it's always going to be there with them. I mean, you talk to players, when they look back on their careers, and they're always going to remember those one or two games that got away from them. And so, but it's also a pretty young group that didn't have anything to do, by and large, with what happened in Cuba, Trinidad. So, that group in particular understands that they have to prove themselves, but, they're looking forward. They're trying to establish themselves in the team. So I'd say overall, the anniversary is not hanging over this particular group to any great degree.
Moving from Tampa Bay to the Bay Area, San Jose, big news the last few days where the San Jose Earthquakes announced their new head coach, Matias Almeida, former coach of Chivas Guadalajara, who just won the CONCACAF Champions League versus Toronto. Jeffrey, correct me if I'm wrong. Is this the biggest signing players or coach in the history of the Quakes, especially if we look at the money that it will cost them?
I would say Landon Donovan was probably bigger.
True.
But, I mean, this one, certainly when you think about this incarnation of the Earthquakes, obviously the teams that Donovan was part of, and, they eventually moved to Houston, and that, a different group came in a few years later. So in terms of this incarnation of the Quakes, yeah, I mean, this is the biggest signing. This is the biggest move that they could have made. And it's a shocker because this is a team, this is an organization that had not shown much in the way of ambition. And so to be able to get a coach with the pedigree of Almeida, I think is really, really impressive. Now, I think fans in San Jose need to be careful because Almeida is not going to be a savior. I mean, it's one of a bunch of decisions that San Jose has to get right in order to get back into the playoff places or at least even approach the upper echelons of the league. I mean, they've got a general manager there in Jesse Fiorinelli, whose personnel decisions have been woeful, to say the least, especially when it comes to recruiting defenders. I don't know that with the possible exception of Guram Kasha, I don't think any of the other defenders that the team has signed have been MLS quality. And this is a guy with a European pedigree. I'm talking about Fiorinelli, who supposedly has these connections and this pipeline to excellent players. So I think, it's awesome for San Jose that they've been able to get Almeida, but, the rest of the front office needs to do their job and do it well and do it a lot better than they've been doing it the last 2 years. Otherwise, I can see Almeida getting frustrated and supposedly he's got, out clauses in his contract to take on national team jobs. And if he gets frustrated with the way things are going, I could easily see him, pulling up stakes and moving on to something else.
The San Jose Earthquakes, for me, are one of the team in the league that has a lot of potential, especially in their market, because it's San Jose, yes, but it's the Bay Area. There's a lot of a population there, a lot of soccer fans as well, especially when you look at ratings of Premier League or other leagues, La Liga, in the Bay Area market. Is this the first move to becoming relevant again in the market, or is it a move in mind where Almeida might help convince players to finally join the Quakes because of, you mentioned, the lack of ambitions of the last few years, lack of result too? There's a certain mentality that, well, if I go to the Quakes, am I going there to win or just to get a paycheck? Now with this move, is it changing?
I think so. I think Almeida is a coach that has great connections, that is hugely charismatic. I mean, he could be the West Coast Tata Martino. Granted, he doesn't quite have Martino's resume coming in, but he's hugely respected in Latin America. It would not surprise me to see him heavily recruit south of the border and even into South America. The Quakes have gotten South American players in the past, but they have not been up to scratch. They haven't been good enough to really kind of change the fortunes of this team. And so I think with Almeida at the helm, I think for as long as Almeida is going to be in San Jose, he's going to take this project very seriously. And I think he's only going to bring in players who share that philosophy, who share that attitude. So yeah, I think this has the potential to be a real game changer. But again, it's, the big question for me is who's picking the players? Is it Almeida? Is it Jesse Fiorinelli? Is it a collaboration? Who has the final say on what gets done? And then, Almeida's going to have an adjustment period as well as he gets up to speed on the crazy MLS roster rules that, the three of us know all too well. So, but I do think it has the potential to be a game changer for sure.
I've been studying those rules for over a decade, and I'm not sure I know them all too well just yet even, which kind of meets your point. What does it say, the hiring, about the league, if anything? Is this a coup for the league, or is it just an isolated situation?
I think it's a continuation of a trend. I think big name, high quality coaches have begun to come in. You see, Tata Martino, you had Patrick Vieira in New York. And there've been some very good American coaches coming up too. I mean, Jesse Marsh does well with the Red Bulls, and then he moves on to an assistant job with Leipzig in the Bundesliga, and Bob Bradley comes back. So I think overall the quality of coaching is definitely getting higher. And I think Almeida is a guy that for sure just ups that level in a positive way. And so yeah, I mean, I think that I don't think this is like something brand new. I mean, I think this is something that fans of MLS have been seeing over the past few years, and I think it can only help the league to have some outside influences, some new ideas, some fresh ideas, being examined, being explored, and exposing the players in the league to these kinds of different coaches.
All right, we'll wrap with this one. Kevin and I were speculating about Chris Wondolowski's future yesterday. What is his long-term future with the Quakes? Is he a guy that's going to decide on his own when he leaves that club, or maybe he might get pushed out the door? Or what do you think his role is going to be moving forward?
I could see Wondolowski's role being similar to what it was this year, where he's kind of a super sub off the bench, the kind of guy who can, he's always been able to sniff out goals, throughout the bulk of his MLS career. So I think even under Matias Almeida, I think that kind of thing has value. So yeah, I would expect Wondolowski to stick around. He loves the club so much. He's a Bay Area guy. It was the Quakes, Mark I that drafted him out of college from Chico State. So, I think the club is very much aware that they have to handle his exit in the right way. Make sure that they don't push him out prematurely or push him out in a way that looks cold and unfeeling. The fans still love him with good reason. So I would, if I were to look into my crystal ball, I would say Chris Wondolowski breaks the record either this year or next year, and then at the end of 2019, at the end of that season, that's when he'll exit.
So you mentioned Landon earlier, so we're not going to, see what Landon did, go down the highway and, put on the Galaxy colors to irritate everyone in San Jose forever. That won't happen.
I tell you, if that had happened in the age of Twitter, I mean, Twitter would have melted down. It's crazy how, looking back, how much that move, where he went to Leverkusen for a bit and then came back in Galaxy colors. It's crazy to think how much that flew under the radar. But, you have to also think about what San Jose was before he got there. I mean, they had failed to make the playoffs, I think, 4 seasons in a row in like a 10 or 12 team league. I mean, that takes some doing. That takes some special levels of incompetence right there. And so when he joined in 2001, and I know you guys are familiar with this, having gone through with Toronto FC.
Yeah.
But I think when he arrived in 2001, and granted that coincided with Frank Yallop becoming the manager and bringing in some quality players like Jeff Agus, and I could go on, but getting Landon Donovan in that team really was the start of the turnaround there.
Fair enough. All right, Jeff, you're there covering Columbia USA. Tell the listeners how they can give you a follow, how they can follow your work.
Yeah, I'm at Jeffrey Carlisle on Twitter. If you're on the ESPN.com/soccer, just go to the search bar and you'll find my work. If you type in my name, so those are the 2 best ways to find me.
All right, enjoy the game tomorrow, and hopefully we'll talk soon.
All right, thanks very much.
You are listening to Soccer Today. Follow us on Twitter at SoccerTodaySPN and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/Sports Podcasting Network. You can find the podcast version of all the shows we do on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play Store, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you get your podcast.
And we're back on Soccer Today. You can follow the show on Twitter at Soccer Today SPN. Duane's at 24th Minute, and I'm at Kev Laramee. Podcast versions of this show are available everywhere you get your podcasts: iTunes, Stitcher, Feedburner, Bob A Player, anywhere you get your podcast. Well, you can find Soccer Today. Duane, that was really nice of Jeff to join us on the show, and let's answer the first question that you asked him. What's the state of the U.S. men's national team right now? Are they worse, in the same shape, or in a better place than a year ago? Duane's probably on mute somewhere around here, but we'll get Duane on the line as soon as possible. And here we go. Duane, are you there? So we'll get Duane. I'll answer the question, and we'll get Duane on the line in a second. But for me, the U.S. men's national team is in a worse spot than it was a year ago. Why? Because if you stay where you are, the rest of the world is passing you by. So if you stay as a coachless team, you're going to stay where you are. You're not progressing. You're not looking at the future. What do you think, Duane? Where is the U.S. men's national team stand right now?
I think the correct answer is the middle answer of the same place they were a year ago. Now, where I differ from other people is where I think that means. I don't think it's as low as a lot of U.S. men's national team fans like to think it is, and they're just not used to failure, right? Like, it's not something they've ever gone through, and this is the Canadian coming out of me. I mean, I always sort of, their infamous night was a night that everything went the wrong way, and they lost on a late goal against TNT. Our infinite night was, infamous night, infinite too. It
San
felt
Pedro
like
Sula, 8-1.
Yeah,
6
8-1,
years ago.
right? So it's a bit of a different scale, right? But when you're used to winning and being successful, and they're absolutely right that the resources should allow them to consistently be in World Cups, and they have consistently been in World Cups. So I don't think they're as low as they think they are. But you're right in terms of the coaching situation that there's a couple different ways to look at this. Is why is it taking it this long? If they're being respectful to Berhalter and the crew of not wanting to distract them, then I mean, too bad the rest of MLS isn't being as respectful to not distracting that team.
Especially the fans and going to watch the crew play in Dallas and be like, yeah, it's our team. Oh man, yeah, that was something. But anyways.
Exactly. So, and the other way to look at it is that the right guy? I mean, I think that they've been pretty clear that they want someone who has MLS experience that's American in their base, and I'm not sure. This is where I kind of agree with American fans that maybe they're not quite at the point where they should be so restrictive in terms of their search. Should this not be a global search? This probably would be. I saw someone on Twitter today saying that it should be a top 10 national team job in the world. And some people may scoff at that. But when you consider all of the factors around that in terms of lifestyle and the money they can offer.
Salary, lifestyle, conditions of work, right? The work environment. You're right. But I think there's something to the aspect of being burned a bit by Klinsmann and wanting to stay away from a big coach with a big ego that doesn't have the emotional attachment to the club that a Berhalter would have, or that an American would have, right? You have that a bit of the disconnect that a international manager comes in not wearing that badge on his sleeve because he's not from that part of the world. I think there's a little something to that, and that disconnect that we did see from Klinsmann sometimes, not necessarily gelling with the fans and gelling with the attitude needed for that position because of the fact that he was German and not American. I think there's something to that.
Yeah, true. And look, Klinsmann's a different animal, and I absolutely would have fired Klinsmann
long time ago
before they did.
Years ago.
He did not do a good job in my mind, and if you look at the failure of the World Cup qualifying, I think you hang it largely on him. Bruce Arena kind of came in and, I don't know, sort of desperately took buckets of water out of the sinking ship, but he wasn't able to get it before it sank all the way, right? Klinsmann.
It's good to put some ping pong ball in the boat, but it's not enough air to make the boat afloat.
Yeah, exactly. So I think where a lot of the frustration comes from not looking foreign, again, would be not necessarily like a guy like Klinsmann or a name like that from Europe. And I mean, we joke about, Mourinho gets fired from United and comes to the U.S. men's national team because they're like big flashiness. And if this was pre-Klinsmann, maybe that might be something that would be less of a joke. Although, we didn't talk about Newcastle United, but he I don't know whether that was a good thing or a bad thing for United fans, but we'll move from that. I think what frustrates a lot of American fans is that they didn't look at Osorio. They didn't look at as not just necessarily any particular Mexican manager or Spanish manager, like it, Latin American manager, but they didn't take into that consideration that sort of need within the program to reach out to the particular like the Americans of those descents, which really a lot of people feel, and I think rightfully feel, they lose a lot of players by not necessarily having those inroads to the Latin expat communities throughout the United States, where there is a lot of talent that just goes to waste. And I think bringing in a Mexican manager, bringing in a Latin American manager would have gone a long way to sort of starting the process of healing that wound that's out there. So I think that's where the frustration comes from.
I would have, imagine you mentioned JCO, Juan Carlos Osorio. Could have been Miguel Herrera too, right? That famous one, that famous, very flashy coach on the sideline, very emotional, totally the opposite of a Klinsmann or a Bruce Arena. And I think that's why I'm still perplexed. If it is Greg Berhalter who's the coach, what's the big difference between, tactically speaking, relationship with players will be different, and the in soccer terms, he's more in the present tactical mindset than a Bruce Arena or Jurgen Klinsmann, even though the game changes really quickly. I kind of want someone with a little bit more, I don't want to say pizzazz, or a bit more, but, it's a job where you kind of need to convey that emotion, and you're the bridge between the front office and the players, and you want to convey the emotion. You want to carry that team, maybe sometimes with emotion. And I don't know, I see manager getting results, and they're more to that spectrum of the scale than to being really calm and calculated, so I think there's something to it. The fact that, they need some enthusiasm on the sideline. It's going to be a young crop of players, and there's a different way to do it. You cannot leave it all in the end of your players, and you have to guide them. And sometimes enthusiasm, emotion, yelling sometimes actually does help.
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, when I look at Berhalter, I think of him as a less successful Bruce Arena in some ways. I mean, maybe he's more tactically involved than Bruce was, but a little less arrogant. But then again,
a little less arrogant. Can't really be more, but that's something for another day.
Yeah, it's you might as well hire Schmidt, for God's sake. Sure. In my mind, it doesn't necessarily inspire me a great deal. Although I guess Berhalter, in terms of his tactics, is a little more evolved. When it comes to the international game, I'm not sure tactics matter as much as motivation and the ability to get your players to buy into whatever system you do put in place and just play it simply and quickly. Because when you're talking about the men's game, as we've talked about many times before, they're coming in for short camps, and you got to get a system in place that's just easily adaptable from people coming all over the place, especially if you're American and you're bringing guys in, a lot of the guys in from Europe. It's got to be quick, and it's got to be something that they can do. I don't know if any advanced tactical knowledge is necessarily going to be front and center in terms of what you're looking for. Look, when it comes to the U.S., the problems to me that they have are more related to some of the stuff I just mentioned a minute ago in terms of, not completely, pay to play. We talked about with Jeff. I talked about outreaches into the Spanish-speaking communities out there.
That's a big one, though. I was going to say, Duane, that's a big one, because every year one or two prospects decide to go play for Mexico. And imagine if those prospects decide otherwise. And sometimes I call it the Sidney LaRue process, where after the youth programs, they decided to switch, and it's like you're our product, and then you move and play for the rival. I don't get it, but yes, there's a lot of that, and maybe a right coach is able to guide that decision the right way for this team. Yeah,
it's guiding the whole system as a whole. Ultimately, I guess what I'm saying is I'm not too sure the hiring of the manager is going to make too much of a difference one way or the other, but it would be certainly a symbolic thing that we can do. And in terms of, the fact that we're a year in and this is dominating the conversation today, I think is as much reflective of the fact that they haven't made this change as it is to do with anything that happened a year ago. I think people might, because they have gone young over the past year, they have got some good results over the past year in terms of the friendlies they've been playing. And of course, they haven't had the opportunity to play non-friendly games. They're not involved in Nations League qualifying. They won't play their first meaningful game until next year's Gold Cup. So it's a long wait for that, and not a lot to prove. But the results we have seen so far do look as good as they were before World Cup qualifying. I'll say that, right? So there's nothing really to get worked up that way. But by not making this change, and look, would there, if it is Berhalter, would it really been that big of a deal to say that at the end of this year I'm going to move on? And yeah,
would have been a big trouble to be like, okay, well, Columbus is in a playoff battle, and they are still at risk of falling out of the playoff if they lose out. If they win one game out of their last two, there could be a potential they stay there. It's still up in the air. So maybe there is something to the fact that, oh, well, our coach leaves us for a few weekends and we lost, and well, we're out of the playoff. Still surprised, by the way, that boat didn't catch more water with the whole Austin thing this year. We'll see. It's not over yet. But, yeah, it's interesting. Like, I can see both sides. I can see Berhalter be like, you're moving to Austin. I don't want to move to Austin. I'm going to take over the U.S. men's national team job, and I'm going to be gone 2 days a month for the rest of the year to take care of my future projects. That could have been okay. Or I can understand why they could be like, we're not going to announce it. We're going to leave it like this. Finish your season, playoff or not. Finish the time in Columbus, and then we'll give you a few weeks break, and then you're officially the U.S. men's national team coach.
Yeah. Oh well, it's we're gonna find out sooner rather than later. I mean, if
it has to be before the Gold Cup, right? If not, there's a big trouble. Big problem.
Well, if it's not in place for the Gold Cup, we're having a whole different conversation at this point. Next year's Gold Cup is going to be fascinating. I'm also really interested to see, and we've talked about this from multiple levels, the U20 trial qualifying in November to see how they're going there. But there's a lot going on in the next year. Olympic qualifying as well will happen next year. I believe it's in Costa Rica. I'd have to verify that. But a lot of interesting stuff going on in the next year. So there's a lot of need to get the direction of all these programs going in the right way. Speaking of other programs, Kevin, just a real brief mention here that if you're looking for Canadian Nations League qualifying previews, we'll be dealing with that tomorrow on Two Solitudes. So $2 a month will get you that. But in terms of the U.S., I don't know. Any thoughts, or do you want to move on to have a little conversation about San Jose, or
just quickly
and go from there?
We'll just finish the show quickly with Matias Almeida, coach of San Jose. I've been belaboring this year few times on the show, Duane, talking about the potential of San Jose and the potential of this club and how irrelevant they are in their own market and how they have a chance to be what I call a type 1 sports franchise in their market because of the demographic of San Jose and the Bay Area, the fact that it's more of a younger demographic, 25 to 35 are really high, especially in the Silicon Valley era. The social media, they're all based in there. So I'm always surprised that the Quakes never went all in with millennials or all in with the potential to attract fans. Is this decision to hire Matias Almeida the first one? And look, the decision is he's not cheap. He's going to be a lot more expensive than Michael Starry was. And so I think it could be beneficial for San Jose. I think Jeffrey is right when he says it all depends. He can come in here, and if he's told no by his GM to do whatever, then he might just pack his bag and leave because it's a failed experiment. I think you have to do like Joey Saputo did in Montreal, even though Joey Saputo and Rémi Garde, they're not the best of friends. Not at all. Joey Saputo hired Rémi Garde, paid a lot of money for his coaching staff, and be like, you know what? You're here now. I'm going to trust you. Manage this club. It's going to be difficult for players acquisition over the next year, I agree. But you try to ride the ship, and then we're trusting you. To whatever extent, whatever the consequence may be, you got the keys to the mansion. And make sure it doesn't burn down. And if I'm San Jose, give the keys to the mansion, to the neighborhood. Give him whatever he needs. Get some more talented player. Get a philosophy in this team, because look, it doesn't have any at every level, from the front office to the sidelines. There's no philosophies. There's no ambition. Almeida changes that.
Yeah, look, the director of football GM model is becoming more and more popular within the world, but it only works if you have a good working relationship between the two bodies, right? Like if you don't, then it's just going to be nothing but conflict, and you're not going to get anything done. So in that case, you want to have the single model, traditional manager model, where the manager makes the decisions. And I would suspect that Almeida's not coming in for a GM manager role. He wants to, because, again, if you don't have control of the players coming in, I'm not too sure what you can really do with that particular lineup right now, in particular history of player acquisition there. And the advantage you have of bringing a guy in like that is he has those connections with a lot of younger Mexican players that might be able to make an immediate and major impact in MLS. MLS has changed a lot in the last few years in terms of it's not quite as easy to turn things around quickly, but it's still not like other leagues out there. You don't have to put 5-year plans in place. You can do it in a year still, if you really get the right players in. Real quickly, you mentioned how there's such potential in the market. I always look, the analogy I use when I'm looking at American MLS markets is as I look at the NHL, if they have successful NHL teams there, which are kind of non-traditional sports, particularly if it's not in a non-northeastern city, and I see that as potential with the same kind of demographics that they're going after there, kind of young and vibrant and more party-oriented and stuff like that. That's why I think, I'm surprised that MLS isn't hell-bent on Vegas at this particular point after watching the World Knights have done.
Well, yeah, watching the lights, though, you're like, yeah, okay. Yeah, maybe that's why.
Yeah, I don't know whether USL means anything anymore in terms of the potential of the market upright, but that's a different topic for a different day. So no, I think it's a good move for the Earthquakes. It does make them relevant. It is going to get them some press. It is certainly going to get them some attention in the Hispanic population in the Bay Area, which is also key to filling that stadium, because really, look, San Jose is technically not a 96er team, but they are in terms of the disadvantages. And we've talked about this before. When the teams that started in the beginning of MLS have that disadvantage of having made a bad first impression way back when, that is very difficult to overcome. And in fact, San Jose now has the disadvantage of having made 2 bad first impressions, because they did have the revival after the original team moved to Houston. So, can you is the third time a charm? I mean, you'd got to do something dramatic, and this was.
Yeah, the thing is they got a nice stadium, and they were never able to be competitive in that stadium. And then before that, it was Buckshaw, and Buckshaw was, for the longest time, the worst stadium and the worst infrastructure, like, in the entire league. You think Columbus Crew Stadium was bad? You've never been to Buckshaw. You think RFK was bad? Okay, it was crumbling, and there was raccoons there, but you've never been to Buckshaw. Now they have a stadium that can support ambition, and I'm still shocked that they haven't carried that ambition mentality over the last 2 to 3 years, especially with the stadium. Yes, it's a bit further away, but it's Santa Clara. It's close to where the 49ers play. It's like, come on. Embrace your location. Embrace the generation upcoming. Embrace what you want to be. Be your best you, and you'll be that. If you don't, you'll never. So I think it's a good advice for everything, but especially for a soccer team.
Yeah, look, I mean, they're at the point, as we see with Chicago, big name signings, don't necessarily move the needle beyond a week or two. Ultimately, winning is the only thing that's going to put those back in when you made that first impression wrong. And speaking of bad stadiums, you're ignoring one. It was, I forget what it was called, the Ball Stadium, the minor league baseball park that Kansas City played in when they were building Children's Mercy. Is it still Children's Mercy? I don't even know. The names, these corporate names flip all the time. The stadium they play in. Anyway, that was pretty bad too. There's been some bad MLS stadiums over the years.
There has been really terrible stadium over the years. All right, Duane, it'll be good for today. It's interesting. We'll see in the next few months how this changes the recruitment and the transfer window for San Jose, and hopefully the U.S. men's national team has a coach over the next few weeks. United States, Colombia in Tampa Bay. There's over 30,000 tickets sold, and the record for Tampa Bay U.S. men's national team game is 31,457. So we'll see if they beat that record. As always, you can follow Duane on social media at 24th Minute, myself at Kev Laramee. We'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Soccer Today, the world of football with a soccer perspective. Until then, have a great soccer.
You can find the podcast version of all the shows we do on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play Store, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you get your podcast.